Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of screaming horses. Cold rain drips onto your face. Your blanket is soaked. Mud covers your boots so heavily that they feel like stone. Somewhere in the darkness ahead of you stands a castle. Tall black walls, burning torches, silent towers watching your camp from above. And hidden behind those walls, thousands of people are waiting for you to die. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the strangest and most miserable realities of medieval warfare. How did medieval armies actually sleep while surrounding an enemy castle? Where did they sleep? How did they survive freezing winters? What happened during the night? How did they avoid surprise attacks? And why did disease, exhaustion, and weather often kill more soldiers than combat itself? Because, despite what movies show us, most medieval warfare was not glorious cavalry charges or heroic duels. It was waiting, cold waiting, hungry waiting, terrified waiting. And for many soldiers, the nights outside a castle were worse than the battles themselves. Long before the first arrow flew, a siege began with movement. Dust clouds appeared first, then banners, then the sound. Thousands of boots crushing dirt roads, oxen pulling wagons, armor rattling together like chains. To villagers nearby, the arrival of an army felt almost like a natural disaster. Fields were destroyed, animals stolen, wells emptied. When English armies marched during the 100 Years' War, entire regions were stripped of food within days. Because feeding medieval armies was incredibly difficult. A force of 10,000 men could consume massive amounts of grain, meat, ale, and water every single day. And once the army finally reached the castle, the real challenge began. Not fighting, sleeping. Because, unlike modern soldiers, medieval armies carried almost no organized infrastructure. There were no portable barracks, no heated shelters, no waterproof equipment. Most men simply slept wherever they could. And sometimes, that place became their home for months, or even years. In films, siege camps often look organized. Real siege camps were usually filthy. The ground around castles became destroyed very quickly. Thousands of boots tore apart grass and soil. Rain transformed roads into deep mud. Horse waste mixed with ash and rotting food. Within weeks, the countryside around a castle could become nearly unrecognizable. A 14th century chronicler once described a siege camp as smelling like wet animals, smoke, and death. Poor soldiers slept on straw, if they were lucky. Many slept directly on wet ground beneath rough tents made from canvas, animal hides, or stolen cloth. And during storms, the tents leaked constantly. Some soldiers woke up in freezing puddles. Others stayed awake entirely because sleeping in soaked clothes during winter could kill you. Nobles and commanders lived differently, of course. Important knights often had large decorated tents, wooden furniture, servants, and better food. But ordinary infantrymen, most slept packed tightly together around weak fires that barely survived the wind. Some even slept sitting upright to avoid lying in mud. And the mud never truly disappeared. Modern people often underestimate medieval weather. Without insulated clothing or waterproof boots, rain became dangerous. Not annoying, dangerous. Weeks of exposure caused infections, fevers, and exhaustion. Soldiers developed trench-like foot conditions centuries before trench warfare officially existed. Many armies suffered horribly during winter campaigns. During the siege of Antioch in 1097, freezing temperatures and starvation devastated Crusader forces. Men reportedly died during the night simply because they lacked proper shelter. Imagine trying to sleep while icy wind blows through torn fabric above your head. Your socks are wet. Your fingers hurt from cold. Smoke from the fire burns your eyes. And tomorrow, you may have to fight. One medieval knight described winter siege camps as places where men rot before battle even begins. And honestly, that was not an exaggeration. Now imagine finally falling asleep after hours beside a weak fire. Suddenly, a horn blasts through darkness. Men start screaming. Torches appear near the castle gate. This was one of the greatest fears during a siege. The nighttime raid. Castle defenders often launched surprise attacks after dark. Their goal was not necessarily to win battles. It was to create chaos. Small groups of defenders rushed from hidden gates carrying axes, torches, and knives. They burned supply wagons, destroyed siege equipment, killed isolated guards, then disappeared back behind the walls before the larger army could react. This meant soldiers rarely slept deeply. Weapons stayed close at all times. Some men slept in armor despite how uncomfortable it was. Others tied horses beside them so they could escape quickly if the camp was attacked. Sleep during a siege was never fully safe. Every strange sound could mean death. At night, medieval siege camps were alive with noise. Coughing echoed everywhere. Blacksmiths repaired damaged armor beside glowing fires. Priests whispered prayers for the dying. Drunken soldiers argued over dice games. Horses screamed unexpectedly in darkness. And somewhere beyond the camp, the castle watched silently. Sometimes defenders deliberately tried to psychologically torture attackers. During certain sieges, defenders played music from castle walls at night. Others shouted insults down at exhausted soldiers below. Imagine hearing laughter from warm stone walls while you freeze outside in rain. The mental pressure was enormous, especially during long sieges where nothing seemed to change. Day after day, night after night, just waiting. One of the strangest things about medieval sieges is that camps slowly became temporary cities. Not just armies. Cities. Merchants arrived hoping to make money. Blacksmiths repaired weapons. Cooks sold food. Priests traveled with soldiers. Camp followers offered gambling, alcohol, or companionship. Some camps even had traveling musicians and entertainers. Because boredom became a serious problem during long sieges, men repaired equipment, played cards or dice, told stories around fires. But beneath all of it remained tension. Everyone understood that violence could explode instantly. One arrow from the walls, one sudden raid, one argument between drunk soldiers, and chaos would begin again. The longer a siege lasted, the more dangerous food shortages became. For both sides, attacking armies usually relied on supply wagons carrying grain, salted meat, ale, and cheese. But medieval logistics were unreliable. Rain destroyed roads. Bandits attacked supply lines. Nearby villages quickly ran out of food. At a siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, some crusaders reportedly suffered severe starvation and dehydration under intense heat. And hunger changes people. Soldiers stole from civilians. Fights broke out over food. There are historical accounts of starving armies boiling leather belts or eating diseased animals. Dead horses became valuable sources of meat. Think about that. An animal that normally carried knights into battle could eventually become dinner for starving soldiers weeks later. The medieval world was brutal in ways modern people rarely imagine. If battle did not kill you, disease might. Thousands of humans crowded together without sanitation created horrifying conditions. Human waste contaminated water. Rotting food attracted rats. Fleas and lice spread constantly. Dysentery was common. So were skin infections, fevers, and respiratory illnesses caused by smoke and damp weather. At some sieges, the smell alone became unbearable. And remember, nobody understood germs. People blamed disease on curses, bad air, or divine punishment. One infected water source could quietly destroy an entire army. Historians believe disease killed enormous numbers of medieval soldiers during campaigns, far more than heroic sword fights ever did. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. Most medieval soldiers were not legendary knights. They were ordinary young men, farmers, laborers, teenagers. Some had never traveled far from home before joining an army. Imagine being 17 years old, freezing beside strangers outside a massive enemy castle hundreds of miles away from your village. At night, veterans probably told terrifying stories beside fires. Stories about failed sieges, starving armies, mass graves after battles. Some young soldiers likely cried quietly in darkness where nobody could see them. Others became numb, because after weeks of exhaustion and fear, some men drowned in moats beneath heavy armor. Others died before even reaching the walls. And if attackers finally entered the castle, the violence could become horrifying, because months of suffering created enormous hatred. Medieval sieges were not clean battles. They were explosions of desperation. Today, medieval castles often look beautiful. Tourists walk through peaceful stone halls taking photographs. But centuries ago, those same walls overlooked camps filled with freezing, exhausted soldiers trying desperately to survive another night. Most of them were not heroes from legends. They were cold young men sleeping in mud beside weak fires, wondering if they would ever return home. And perhaps that is the real story of medieval warfare. Not glory, not honor, but endurance. Because outside those castle walls, victory often belonged to the army that could suffer the longest. If you enjoy this journey into the darker realities of history, subscribe for more stories about medieval survival, forgotten warfare, and the terrifying realities of the ancient world. And tonight, when you lie down in a warm bed indoors, imagine trying to sleep outside an enemy castle while rain falls endlessly into the mud around you.